Failed to ID case. If you've been charged with this, is there a way to get it dismissed? How do you defend it? I'm Jeff Hampton with the Fulgham Law Firm. Thanks for joining us here today on our YouTube channel. Today I want to talk to you about how to beat a fail to ID case in the state of Texas. And not just that, but just generally kind of go over what does the law say? When do I have to give a police officer my name, date of birth, all that information? When can I be quiet? Does it really matter? So by the way, if you wait around to the end of this video, I'm also going to give you a free ebook, What to Do If You Have Been Charged with a Crime in Texas. Now, the question that comes up is, I have people ask me this all the time, just friends, family. They've said, listen, I don't really know what to do. How do you behave around a police officer? Police officer starts walking up to you and trying to speak to you. What do you have to provide to them? What do you not? When are you actually required by law to give them your identification or information? And what can happen to me if I don't, right? Well, by the way, generally, it's always a good idea to be pretty tight-lipped around the police, okay? You have a Fifth Amendment right not to say anything to incriminate yourself in any way. And by the way, you also have a Sixth Amendment right to counsel. So you can always say, hey, no problem, officer. If they start trying to interrogate you or ask you questions, you can always get the advice of counsel and have them step in this process. But what if a police officer walks up to you and just wants to ask you basic information about who you are? Who are you? Why are you here? What's going on? Well, under Texas statutes, there are certain statutes called offenses against public administration. And so the police frequently like to come up and ask people to provide their name, their address, and their date of birth. Now, whatever the context, it's only under certain contexts that you're actually required to provide this information. But here's where people get in trouble. In an effort to not know what to do, then some people give false information to the police. That's where things go way wrong, okay? So when people give false information to the police, that's when you can pretty much guarantee almost every time you're going to be charged with a failure to identify under Texas law. So what's the first question? When am I required to identify myself to a Texas police officer? So anytime you're speaking to law enforcement, it's important to be aware of the information you are legally required to provide. So legally, you are only required to give your name, your address, and your date of birth to the police if you are placed under lawful arrest. If you are placed under lawful arrest. Under other situations, for example, let's say if you're being detained but not under arrest, the officer just walks up and starts talking to you. You are not required to disclose all that information to the police officer. You're not required to do that. However, instead of just saying, I'm not going to cooperate with this, officer, I'm moving on, instead of kind of deciding you're not going to say something, so many people decide to give the wrong information. They change their date of birth just a little bit, or maybe they don't give their full name and they just misrepresent part of their name. And so here's when you can be charged legally with failure to identify. You have two scenarios that give rise to a Texas charge of failure to identify. Number one, the individual is under a lawful arrest and either refuses to disclose their identity or gives false identifying information. Okay? So number one, someone's under lawful arrest. Number two, that someone is just speaking with the police and maybe it's just freely discussing, or maybe they're being detained but not arrested, and they give false information. So one is you're under arrest. The other one, it's a free conversation, but somebody gives false information. So giving false information when your identity is requested. So when speaking, police commonly ask people, who are you? Hey, do you mind if I can take a look at your ID? I've had cops walk up to me and just being at a large public venue or something, and they just ask a question. Hey, who are you? Do you mind if I see your ID? Or they pull you over and they want to see your ID and they want to talk to you in more depth. So the point is, you're not required to always reveal your identity, but you're always required to not give false information. You must not give that false information. For example, here's an example of someone we represented. The client, their neighbors were having a loud party that was going on. It was really loud, and they decided it was time to call the cops, break it up, right? Didn't want this going on anymore. And so the police, on the phone and when they get there, they asked for that person's name. Well, the client didn't want their neighbors to know they complained. Okay. They were afraid about the neighbors finding out they complained about the noise issues. So what did the client, they just made it up. They just lied. They just gave another name, a different name, a false name. So what happens is the police break up the party. They find some other illegal activity that was going on that needed to be investigated. And so what they do is they go back to our client and they find out that he didn't give the correct information related to his name. And now when he was calling for a good reason, the police are turning their focus over to him saying, listen here, buddy, why did you tell us a name that wasn't accurate? Why didn't you tell us your correct date of birth? And as a result of that, he ends up being charged with failure to identify. And by the way, I want to give you 2 quick breakdowns. Failure to identify is a Class B misdemeanor under Texas law, which means it's punishable by up to 180 days in jail and up to a $2,000 fine. However, if you fail to identify and you have a warrant out for your arrest, that's called a failure to identify fugitive, which means now it's a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by up to a year in county jail and up to a $4,000 fine. It's a big difference. Sometimes the biggest reason people don't want to say who they are is they think they've got a traffic warrant, so they don't want to say anything to the officer. But be careful. If you give false information, you're facing a much more serious charge now than what you were looking at with your traffic warrant, okay? So that's the first instance that we're talking about here is the number one issue was giving false information when your identity is requested. The next is giving false identification while detained. So even if an individual is just being questioned or detained for a moment, they're not always required to provide all of their personal information, but you still must give information that's accurate and not false. So for example, let's say your friend was involved in a crime. Let's just use this as an example. The police maybe take you in for questioning, meaning that you are detained, but you're not under arrest. They're just asking you a few questions. Afraid that you'll somehow incriminate your friend, you give the police a false name. Okay? If you give them a false name, ultimately the police find out or learn that you gave them a false identity, and suddenly you are now facing a separate charge. Regardless of whatever else they were investigating, you're facing a separate charge of failure to identify. Finally, the third example we want to look at is refusing to identify when under arrest. So remember, if you are placed under lawful arrest, you are required to provide to that police officer your identifying information, including your name, your address, and your date of birth. That is required. For example, say you're unexpectedly placed under arrest, and in fact, you've done nothing wrong. In fact, you absolutely know that you've done nothing wrong. And you're defiant about it because you know you're not, let's say it's a public intoxication. You're not drunk. The police officers are arresting you wrongfully. Now they want to know who you are, right? So the point is, you remember, you say, well, I'm supposed to remain silent. I'm going to remain silent. I'm not going to tell the police officers anything. Technically, if you remain silent, you could now be facing 2 charges. Not only the actual charge that you were arrested for, but potentially a new charge of a failure to identify oneself after being lawfully arrested, okay? Now, when talking to police, know exactly what you're facing. Know when you have to speak to them, know when you don't have to, and I hope this was of help to you. Maybe you or a loved one is facing a failure to identify charge in Texas, and maybe you would like a free case evaluation. Don't hesitate to contact the Fulgham Law Firm at 817-877-3030. We'll be happy to unpack your situation and see if we can be of assistance to you. And by the way, you waited around to the end of this long video for a free ebook, What to Do If You Have Been Charged with a Crime in Texas. Click the link down here below in the description section of this video, and we'll be happy to send it right over to you. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, subscribe to our YouTube channel. We look forward to sending you more great content just like this. Take care.